we are live. Welcome back to our weekly Startup Cities Live. I'm Jean Hansen. I'm here with Kim Adams and Eric Mick to discuss the latest news and projects in the network state and startup cities ecosystem. Today, we are very excited to have Art Finch as our special guest. He has been involved in charter cities for several years, having started a new city in Bhutan focused on education, which we'll discuss in more detail. And now he's building the League of Free Cities. So, yep, welcome, Art. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Jean. It's really a pleasure to be here. Looking forward to the chat today and appreciate you guys having me on. Thank you.
Yeah, sure. How are you doing, Eric? Ken?
Pretty good. A bit tired. Just come back from Asia, so jet lag.
Yeah, we are starting the marathon in Latin America, so we have a bunch of events happening, DevConnect, if Latin, and a bunch of crypto network states related. So excited. Okay, so my first question is, so you were involved in this education focused city in Bhutan. Do you want to tell us how you ended up in this project? What's the goal and what's the current status?
Sure. I'm going to start with the end, so I have nothing to do with Bhutan anymore, but I'm going to go to the beginning now. Bhutan, about 15 years of my working life I put into kind of unlocking the project in Bhutan. It was an intentional move there about 15 years ago to try and unlock an initial version of a charter city, which was at that time centered around education. I actually went and attached with the university there for a year, and then I was invited back by the first democratically elected prime minister, because it had transitioned from an absolute monarchy. Actually, the previous king, the fourth king of Bhutan is a monarchy, kind of like the UK, where the monarch is supposed to be, ceremonial and all of that. The fourth king, the previous king, made the country a democracy, and then his son took over under a democracy, and then that was the first government was elected, I think, around 2018. I may be wrong, but it's close to that. So that prime minister actually invited me back as his guest, and I worked looking into sort of our collaboration with an education city project. That government was then pushed out. Next government came in. We shelved that project. I was there for another 5-year term of that government. We did try and push through an FDI, a foreign direct investment company in telecom, because there was an opportunity there to cut the cost of internet by about 10x. Basically, the Bhutan state telecom called Bhutan Telecom and one other very closely integrated corporation were the only ones providing internet, and they were charging, they were a bit too expensive. Part of it was the redundancy, and part of it was just because they had a monopoly, redundant technology. So we proposed an alternative that didn't go very well. Tried to make that happen, but basically the government didn't want that because it would have cut their biggest cash cow. So Bhutan Telecom was their biggest cash cow at the time. So I was already starting to step on toes back in 2015, 2016 in Bhutan. But I spent, basically in about 2020, a new government came in. I'm confusing the dates. The 2018 was when the new government came in. That was the one behind the Gelefu Mindfulness City project that everyone talks about now. So that government basically, they didn't have any concept of this kind of project when they came in 2018. But I'd already talked to the prime minister. I think I can say this at this stage. I'd already talked to the prime minister prior to him going into office and said, you guys should really do something like this. And in about 2020, they basically agreed. So we raised some capital. Our anchor check was Pronomos Capital by Patrick Friedman. And their anchors for that VC are folks like Peter Thiel and Mark Andreessen. So we took a check from Pronomos, and we took a couple other checks about 6 months to a year later as well. And we did the feasibility work. We developed the proposal. We had a bunch of meetings. We flew in experts. We had other experts. A lot of people in our space obviously were involved in the network city, network state and charter city space got involved. But despite us leading on the project, despite the government licensing us as under our name, which was given to us by a religious leader in Bhutan. So the name was Yungdrum, and they licensed us under Druk Yungdrum. Druk is the Bhutanese name for Bhutan, so it kind of means Bhutan. It actually means dragon, but it kind of means Bhutan. And so the government puts Druk in the front of all of its sort of partially state-owned companies. So they insisted that we put Druk in front of our company because it was going to be a PPP with the government, and they wanted us to have that PPP with DHI, Druk Holdings and Investments, which is their sovereign wealth fund. So we were, negotiating to finalize the PPP. We were licensed, and just, lining up. Main thing that we did was line up a lot of tenant investment, so second layer investment for the zone. We actually had about $2 billion worth of letters of intent committed. Now, this is non-binding, but a slight majority of that would have probably closed if Bhutan had kept the original structure. So they lost about over $1 billion of investment from these sorts of tenants that were typically in industry and agriculture that we had lined up. When they, I'm cutting to the chase here, when they expropriated the project, the way they did that was they put out a statement. Basically, the king ordered the prime minister to put out a statement saying that we had nothing to do with the project, and they also cancelled our license 2 days before that. So the statement they made was, we have no affiliation with the government, no formal affiliation with the government. But that was 2 days after they cancelled our business license. So that was, pretty upsetting. Not just for me, obviously, for our whole team, for my Bhutanese family. But we spent about 6 months, this was in 2023, spent about 6 months trying to repair things, warned them that we'd have to put something out on public record, if they didn't, retract that statement somehow. Basically, 2 days before the king announced the project to the country, Forbes put out an article pointing out that this was originally our idea. We didn't hit very hard with that. We didn't sort of say, oh, they cancelled our license and everything. Obviously, Forbes had done that background. They knew all of that. But we were intentionally still trying to keep it a soft approach with Bhutan. So that I think that the main reason was just, to make sure that we didn't run into any serious risks there with Bhutan, in terms of my family, etc. So, it was pretty unfortunate to lose the project, but here's the cool thing. What that project did achieve in terms of breaking the glass ceiling for South Asia in particular, but kind of for the world, is a 60,000 acre special administrative region. We proposed it as a special executive zone, as a special economic zone, but they reframed it as a special administrative region, which I think was a wise branding move, because it parallels to Hong Kong, right, which was Hong Kong is a large part of why China developed so well, and Bhutan really wanted to position as well as a Hong Kong for India. Because Bhutan's market isn't particularly exciting. The reason we were able to attract, up to $2 billion of letters of intent was because we focused on Bhutan's free trade arrangement with India. And India's, as Trump has made clear, very restrictive in terms of their tariffs and stuff. So having that sort of skeleton key to sell to India and manufacture from Bhutan was actually quite attractive. Anyway, since they expropriated the project, it just seems more like a master plan, beautiful city that's just going to be, a lot of money spent to build this tertiary infrastructure. There doesn't seem to be a lot going on from the industry side, from the agriculture side, which is a pity because that's Bhutan's low-hanging fruit. And anyone who's studied our space and knows about Shenzhen and Dubai, and they started with industry and agritech and actual economic engines, and then the city organically grew because of that. You don't build the city and then the other stuff happens, or it never happens. You need the other stuff. You need cheap capital goods for construction. You need jobs. You need investment coming in, and all of that stuff. So that's the first place to start. And I'm not sure Bhutan fully realizes that, so they should get back to that. But I do wish the project the best. I lived in Bhutan, as I say, for a long time, and I love the people. I love the country's potential, and I know that it faces something of an existential threat in terms of geopolitics. And if it doesn't have the soft power that this project could unlock, not sure what will exactly happen there, whether it'll really be a sovereign country in 10 years. So I want it to be a sovereign country because there's something really unique there. That said, there needs to be a lot of caution. People interacting with Bhutan, in my opinion, they should be cautious. cautious. You probably have a question that would be more relevant than me just going on. So conversation is better.
Yeah, that's an amazing journey. I think you probably in just a few years had a lot of experience in learnings, and I'm curious about like your main takeaways for the projects in the West. Like there's this emerging uh, projects, startup cities. There's Prospera. There's pop-up cities happening. Like, what are your main takeaways and learnings to share for these projects that are just getting started?
Yeah. So I think you have to do a couple of things in parallel. One of them is sort of what you guys are doing really well, which is community building and tech optimism and culture building. Another one is definitely that sort of core economic engine. And while digital nomads and things like that can generate revenue and so on, I don't think that's what you really need. You need, in and of itself, you need that, but it's not enough. You really need to look at your economics and say, like, what's the unique economic opportunity in this particular geography, in this particular country, or because of specific regional policies and trade policies and things like that. Like, where can we really shake things up here so that there's like a lot of investment coming in, not necessarily investment that we have to raise. So there's also this need to integrate, right? Like, not to try and control everything yourself. You need to be willing to actually say, okay, the reason we're taking on private governance is not to run all of the projects ourselves, kind of like the worst version of governance. You can do that, especially when you're small, and it makes sense. And also you can optimize that and so on. But long term, that shouldn't be the vision. And in my view, like, very early on, you should have a structure where other people can come in and operate with relative autonomy. You might even want to do that before you get a regulatory unlock, like just in terms of internal structuring. And so what that would look like is investors coming in that want to do things like farming or want to do things like set up a factory. You might want to make sure it's a clean factory, right? That's not going to pollute if you have a lifestyle appeal that you want to keep. So like, we targeted completely clean tech stuff in Bhutan for a variety of reasons, but we were also situated, that site in Gillifu is situated right next to the Manas National Park, which is a bi-country park between India and Bhutan. And it's a beautiful area with like really high biodiversity, some of the highest biodiversity in the region. And so it was really important not to have like looting industry coming in. Yeah, I think the economic engine, specifically like industry, agriculture at a small scale. And one of the problems there, right, is that you might not have enough land. So you need to plan for that. And you need to try and make sure you have enough land that you can actually attract these folks. I think that's one of the problems that maybe Prospera has faced, but they do have land that they can expand into. I'm not sure exactly what's happening there, but I think the economic engine in terms of like industry, manufacturing, I may have said that a few times, is probably the key part. Yeah, there's other things as well. So like the regulatory unlock is another thing you do in parallel, and you might need to approach that in a phased manner, right? If you want to be like very pragmatic and realistic. It's not that you won't necessarily get your sudden unlock. It's that you can't really start the conversation right there with most governments, where you say, okay, we want autonomy of everything except criminal law and the Constitution. That's difficult. But if you say, yeah, we're bringing in this industry now in this land that we've kind of demarcated. So you've done your due diligence. You know that it's land that you can actually possibly get from the government, or you can buy, and you've locked in your options if it's private. Even if you're leasing because you're still, trying to bootstrap. I think you just need to plan like so that you can move into a space where you have space for the economic engine, and you also need to plan your regulatory approach to do it like in a phased way. I think that's what a lot of projects are struggling with. I have to say though, like Alpha Cities, for example, that Bradford and Patry are leading on, they've fully integrated the economic engine model. They've pivoted from, I think, what Prospera originally started. I think Prospera is also pivoting in that, but they like Alpha Cities is all about integrating all the economic engine stuff, and that's really important. That's why those projects could actually unlock in a couple of those countries they're targeting, because the government understands that stuff, but they don't really understand, the rest very well. So that's a big one. And geopolitics is another big one, but yeah. But we could unwrap that later.
Yeah, for sure. And I'm curious about, I'm very interested in this topic of economic engines, and you talked about like manufacturing and land, but I'm curious about, do you think it's possible to create like this economic engine exclusively or primarily on the digital realm, like a digital zone, focusing on remote work? How do you think about that?
I think that's another piece. Before this conversation started, Kim mentioned like Crescimento and some of the work they're doing. I know that they've been focused on a digital special economic zone, which doesn't have a physical presence. And there is an economic opportunity there. I remember them explaining some of that to me, and it made sense. So the digital route is there. There's a lot of folks that seem to be looking into that quite strongly. I think effectively, I may be wrong, but I think effectively the zone project in Kazakhstan that Forma is working on and Solana is, their actual angle is kind of digital, even though there's physical infrastructure like that's run by the government, the physical side mostly. So their economic aspect seems to be more digital. I may be wrong there, but that's my understanding, just roughly. So there must be something there, because a lot of people that are very intelligent and qualified and competent are targeting that. But it's not necessarily something that's well proven just yet. Except maybe by Delaware, if you want to look at their, like, if you had the regulatory side, right, and then you take like a domicile. But the domicile stuff is getting a bit old hat, and there's so many jurisdictions that are competing, and there's like investor credibility concerns and what we call path dependency, where people just want to do what they've been doing before, and the whole infrastructure is geared towards that. So it's kind of difficult. I mean, Prospera is trying that angle, I think, as well. I'm not convinced that should be your only focus. I also think it's healthy for people to like move into spaces they aren't fully comfortable in and try and figure those out. I think it helps with the stuff that they're doing as well. Maybe they see an integration. Just my opinion.
Yeah. Well, one last question before I pass the mic. So you mentioned about education. So your idea of creating a charter city was to solve the educational problem, as I understand. And my question is, do you think that these private cities or charter cities, startup cities of the futures will be created around a specific goal? So the cities of the past are not like that. There is like economic space. So you have like some foundational legal structure and so on. But now we are moving to like a biotech city, education city, and other types of cities. Do you think this is the future, or is it going to be like a mix of things?
Um,
And why is that case?
Sure. Yeah, I mean, in my opinion, my 2 cents. I think yes, like inevitably, even not necessarily by intention, projects will end up specializing in particular areas, right? That'll just naturally happen because of, it might even be because of geography in some cases, but it could also probably in this world that we live in be about the agglomeration of talent and culture that they have, like where that core focus is. And so that means that when they set out with an intention to do, longevity or R&D or education or fintech, they probably will, get a lot more momentum in that direction. And so they're more likely to go down that path. But again, if they're kind of taking an open mindset and they're keeping an eye out and trying a few other things, they might suddenly realize that there's like a golden opportunity sitting right there to do something quite different. I don't think Bhutan, just as an example, 10 plus years ago, they didn't realize that Bitcoin would be, a bit of a salvation for them. And then they initially just tried their hand at it. I was very privy to that. We proposed a NASDAQ listed Bitcoin miner, like before they started doing anything at scale. We said to them, you guys should really look into this because you have major renewable power. Nepal also has that opportunity, but the government's dysfunctional. They started like very small pilots. And it was just like made a lot of sense. So they kept scaling that up. If they hadn't started the small pilots, they probably would never have actually been in the position that they got into, which was pretty decent for a country of that size in terms of like, producing more than your GDP in Bitcoin dividends. Yeah, I think you need to try different little things. Like in small scale, and that's another part of the economic engine. But to answer your question, sorry, yes, I think like these projects will inevitably end up being focused in particular areas. I'm not sure that Prospero was going to be like dominated by Infinita all along, but like that seems to be the case now, just from an outside point of view. So it does seem to be that that's what's happening.
Yeah, I think the projects of Bradford, Alpha City is like crypto city, because you can structure the economic and the legal structure towards that direction, and then there's AI and other things. So I agree with you. I think we are going towards that direction. Eric, do you have questions?
We've been covering a lot of things already. I kind of agree there will be like specialized cities, as a little bit like there are specialized companies to get better at a specific industry. But like we're seeing a lot of models to get there, and like you already mentioned, charter city, free cities, free private cities, or special economic zones. So like, what's your guide like for listeners? What are the definitions and the overlaps between those concepts?
Yeah. So, I mean, obviously we have like try and see if I can like summarize the status quo very briefly. I mean, we have like the original special economic zones that everyone's pretty familiar with. That model kind of started out in Ireland, actually. China was very quick on that, by the way. China had people there, they explored that, oh, this works, and they applied it in like Shenzhen and other cities and made them pretty much autonomous, and also applied some of that sort of best practice law that was kind of capitalism, right? Because China wasn't capitalist at that time. And it worked. And then they replicated that. And that's pretty much the story of what developed China. So special economic zones of the traditional nature are typically export focused. They're kind of just a niche. They're not full service, like full sector, where you can have all different businesses. You're limited. I mean, you still have zones nowadays that are very much like service sector oriented, just like financial. So most of the like city zones, like Dubai International Financial City, or in Sri Lanka, Colombo Port City, they're financial service sector oriented, but they're still special economic zones, especially technically, but even they might identify as that. You have your normal SEZs, and really these are also like Bangladesh, because I'm familiar with South Asia. Bangladesh, their development and their poverty levels were like this, like they really did a lot of, they were very successful using the traditional SEZ model, although it was, labor intensive and not necessarily the best conditions for the labor. That model is like what everyone thinks of in most of the world when you talk about a special economic zone, and it's not something that necessarily people like love, from the West, where they live very comfortable lives and they can't imagine like that being the only option of almost like sweatshop work. But for people that have no other option, it still obviously worked, or they wouldn't be there most of the time. So that's the model that like is very old and legacy stuff. But what we're seeing now increasingly is just higher degrees of autonomy, and also diversification from like just the service sector or just the export-oriented sector, and in some cases integration. And that's what I'm arguing for. I'm saying like you need to see more integration, and a charter city should be fully integrated as much as possible. It really shouldn't just limit itself to one thing. Although inevitably, back to Jean's point, it's going to go to one particular sector eventually, because one sector is going to dominate. Like it's not possible that they're all exactly, and in some cases really dominate, right? I think Dubai has like a very specific appeal. Shenzhen, as you would know, Eric, has a very specific, strengths that like cater to, people like yourself that do R&D and hardware and stuff like that. I think charter cities are defined typically as having autonomy, except that they obviously are under the constitution of the country they're in. Therefore, they're part of that country. They're not sovereign. Using the word sovereign is kind of misleading. It's also going to backfire politically. It's something that we love in the crypto world, and it kind of has a slightly different context there because we're talking about our individual sovereignty. But when you're talking about the sovereignty of a zone in the context of a government giving you permission, that raises a lot of hullabaloo, and it's not necessarily recommended. It's fair game to use that terminology within your audience.
So then a free city is more sovereign?
Yeah, a free city is more sovereign than special economic zone. I mean, the main thing that I think qualifies a free city is that they can actually write their own laws. They typically wouldn't have the ability to write criminal law. In most cases, what we're targeting and what seems to be like palatable to global South governments in particular is that the global South governments set the criminal law. That said, in the case of Bhutan, actually, they do have autonomy in criminal law, to my understanding. Although it's a bit opaque, the whole system there in terms of the special administrative region, they effectively, to my knowledge, have autonomy.
Okay, so you said what we are targeting. So you're already going towards the League of Free Cities, which is your current project. Do you want to give us an intro for that and the vision for the future?
Yeah, sure. So really, after what happened in Bhutan, I obviously have a need and a drive to really figure out like how could this be avoided, what's really happening in the space, why don't we have a lot of free city projects coming up, and how do I make sure that other people don't waste their life's work or feel like it, even though of course we're all in the longevity movement too, so fingers crossed. But League of Free Cities was basically a realization that you're not going to get projects unlocked unless you approach it very strategically and you understand some things that go unsaid and that are just non-obvious in terms of approaching global South governments. I mean, I'm talking about global South governments because otherwise it doesn't really make as much sense in theory. Although these days I think Europe could benefit from a lot of free cities, but it's just my opinion. They're not going to do it. So global South countries typically are the ones that you would be targeting, and there's a couple non-obvious points. Basically, what we try and do we try and identify founders like of independent projects, so even folks like Heap City. If the end goal is to have a charter city, to have a reasonable degree of autonomy, then we offer pretty much initially free support, advice, like best practices from our experience and also from the experience of other founders that we're talking to, all the time, and say, this is what you probably, may be missing, or also we might, help them in terms of how do you navigate the global South governments, like what are the non-obvious aspects, how do you avoid just like being ganked by a bunch of consultant types, because that's typically what most people fall into. You have like local consultants that will promise you everything, and I don't know, I see people softly nodding, but I hope that's not the case for Heap City. But yeah, you have these consultants coming in that sometimes are a bit extractive, particularly in the global South countries, because that's what they do, and then the government works with them to get a cut, and so you've got to like navigate all of that. And there's a couple ways we do that. Like one thing we do is we advise to set like an anti-corruption pillar publicly in countries that have high corruption, where you're going to actually say that, you're signing an MOU with the government. It may be non-binding, but something like if you guys don't engage in any corruption, if you don't ask us for money, we're going to tell everyone that you didn't, and we're going to make it, we're going to use our press connections to get you really good press, and that's going to help you get reelected. So there's another way to you have to reward people for doing the right thing. You can't just say like, no, we're not going to pay you money, we're not going to bribe you. Sorry, you've got to actually offer something else. So that's what we sort of come up with right now, is just trying to get good press for people that are actually taking the clean route. League of Free Cities is advising founders. We're trying to line up 50 plus projects by 2030. That's our ambitious goal that a lot of people sort of scoff at. 50 plus projects. We want to see that many free cities either unlocked or on the verge of being unlocked. And then we have our own like special thing that we want to bring to the table that we think will help a lot of these projects get unlocked, which is kind of basically a fun, but a bit more complicated than that.
I'm interested in that. I mean, you mentioned Pronomos, who funded you before, and we can see more and more VCs getting into the space. So, what would you say is the latest status of like general VCs and their vision on charter cities, which are not startups, but they are similar, and they can also have a return on investment. It's kind of an interesting change in the world. What's your perspective?
I don't think there's a lot of dedicated VCs, right? Apart from Pronomos. and like network state, network school, you know, they do help out a lot of projects and take a stake, not a big stake, to my knowledge, but like in terms of capital moving, I agree with you. I think there's a lot of capital moving, but I think some of it's coming from like, you know, different places. You know, the vast majority of our funds that we raised, you know, in the Bhutan project and subsequent projects, typically comes, I would say it's like a lot of it comes from the crypto verticals. They sort of somehow that makes sense to them. And then, you know, there are other aspects, like some traditional aspects that come into play, and also people that are trying to innovate in areas that the government's really restrictive on. You know, so one example is the built world, like people that are. So we have one small investor, for example, that they've worked on lighting solutions and acoustics that are sort of, you know, they're built around the concept of biophilia or biocentrism, which means that and before people sort of like, you know, do they like do anyway, the technology for these lights is even used by hospitals and so on, because they have a specific frequency that's actually good for your health, and like the governments don't incentivize or do anything good for that. And also, and obviously 3D construction, things like this, all the kind of cutting edge techno optimist space. If there's any capital there, then they're kind of interested in taking a small bet on these projects. Another reason to integrate, right? And try and find all of those little like economic options. You know, one of them is obviously hospitality. You can, if you have enough land, you can find a hospitality partner that can actually do much cheaper and yet much higher value construction with technology that's available today, but no one can really implement for government, you know, because of government restrictions. Just as an example. And there are some, you know, some spaces that are doing quite well with that. Like, you know, there's Nomad, right? Nomad's already in Prospera. They're doing very well with that. They were invited to Bhutan. I believe that's public information. And there's a couple others. I mean, we have a partner that's in Mexico at the moment, and they can ship out on containers, you know, these like pre-built shells that you can just construct modular construction in 90 days, and you do the internals, and you have, you know, like they can be fully customized. That kind of stuff you can't do in much of the world. Those folks can also bring in checks. I know I'm like seem to be going on a tangent, and I probably am, but yeah, in terms of the VC stuff, you kind of have to find the people that are already your natural allies, but they're not exclusively dedicated to this space. And I mean, in my experience, I mean, Eric, do you find like there's a lot of VCs that are, you know, targeting our space nowadays?
Yeah, like you said, with crypto, there's more and more that are getting interested. Like the cyber fund has been in there for a long time. A16Z is definitely a contender. So more and more TradFi VCs are looking at the space, which is very good, right? And
Yeah.
because of what you said, like there's so many things in a CDE. You could be in construction or medical or education. It doesn't really matter if it's a very good business idea. It's still part of the ecosystem. But I assume with the League of Cities, you're building an ecosystem. So because it's a league, right? And so if you have all of those projects, whether they are like charter cities or construction companies, how do you see the coordination? Do you have any ideas for a governance layer or stuff like that?
Yeah, I mean, it's not like we would build that ourselves. We did think about that, and then we like very quickly realized we don't want to build the tech stack that might be shared by the projects that opt in to use that tech stack that we're working with, because there's too many people that are just doing that way better, you know, already. So we just have partners now that we could like potentially say you might want to use them for the tech stack. I mean, there's so many I could name, but I think that the way that, so we think of the League of Free Cities kind of like as a meta network state, where a network state is a bunch of people that are aligned about a single value. When it comes to League of Free Cities, it's a bunch of cities instead of people that are aligned around a single value, which is the maximum autonomy of each individual city or project. So we're not like trying to put an umbrella over them and restrict them and say like, you need to do this or like franchise or something. They're independent projects, and we literally have a mandate to maximize their independence, which also means whatever they're doing internally is way like out of our scope. We don't get involved in that. we can give them advice, like from an investability perspective, from a like feasibility perspective, and it's our opinions. They may see things better. Like one of the things that I always say people need to do is they need to go and live in the country that they're planning to unlock, a project in. So if you're on the ground there, you're going to have insights that you would never otherwise have. And when it comes to like understanding how global South governments work, it's an onion that gets kind of dark. So you have to dig through that, and that takes time, and you have to be on the ground to do that. It can get really dark, but let's not go there. So I think I think you're right though. I think obviously the big guys like A16Z and stuff are in, Hope that answers the question.
You're borrowing some ideas from the cosmolocalism, like local hardware for the needs of the people, and then the global layer for tech stack tools that can be shared by everyone.
Yeah, it's like mostly best practices, and also founders can coordinate with each other, right? So when we were initially took a check from Pronomos, one of the coolest things they did was they just had all the founders getting on a weekly call and just like sharing, there's moral support, but there's also like a lot that you glean from that, particularly, in the beginning. And so that's one big aspect of it. People that are fighting the same battle. I do think that people in this space need to collaborate more, like independent projects. I think they would find that would be really valuable. I'm not saying that they should be anti-competitive. I'm just saying that particularly if you're focused on the same country, there's a really good opportunity there to collaborate while you're still trying to get the unlock. And sure, you can take the gloves off if everyone gets a zone, but prior to that, you probably really want to collaborate because otherwise you kind of step on each other's toes, and you don't actually get your zone that you want, and it doesn't work. Because in Argentina, for example, there's like 8 projects, so they need to work together.
Agreed. Oh, there's so much more I could say, but no, I should also give the mic, I guess.
Yeah, that's like a whole other topic in itself. Okay, this might be a silly question, but what's the difference between a free city and a private free city?
Just preferred terminology, I think. It's just like how everything goes these days, where it just gets shorter and sweeter. I think it's the same thing. I mean, technically, you could say that a free city may not be privately run. It might be run by the government, but in my view, that's a bit of a, those don't really fit. So it should always be a private city. I think just free private cities were popularized, like particularly by Tibulis and those folks. And then the Free Cities Foundation came along and they just shortened it, but they literally came out of Tibulis. So it's the same thing, really. It's just a shortened version.
And what would you say is like generally the best pointer or best example of like a free city model that is fully function, actually follow the pillars and the principles that you guys like envision?
Yeah, there isn't a great example in terms of like what's like numbers, right? Like how big is it? How much how much money is it raised? I think Prospera is the leading example. I think we all kind of agree on that, and that's why it's so important that Prospera does succeed. But otherwise, you can always infer from like de facto free cities like Dubai. Well, Dubai is a good example because it's run by a sheikh who has full private control over the project, runs it a bit like a corporation would, and so you can kind of see what can be done, right? And that's why we always point to Dubai. But there isn't otherwise a very large scale example. There's a lot of projects that are like close and they're doing really well. Like in Africa, there's the Rendever group, right, that have a bunch of city projects across the across the continent. And some of those have raised billions and they're doing very well, particularly the one in Kenya called Tatu City. But it's not a free city because it doesn't have the ability to craft its own law. Although it does get to kind of operate somewhat, it does operate under unique law and it's full sector. So it's not just like service sector or export. Now, if they were to upgrade, and I don't know, maybe that's something they want to do, I have no idea. But if they were to upgrade and get some autonomy, then, more autonomy, then I'm sure they would actually demonstrate very quickly because they're in a good position to, what can be done at a free city level. But yeah, there aren't enough examples. It's a problem.
So yeah, that's a good point. Oh, I think I'm hearing an echo on someone's side. Um, so I'm here at EdCity, and one thing that has been coming up often is, is this like neocolonialism? Like, are we repeating the cycle? And what's sort of your take to that? If you have like a private city that is ran by like, this private set of individuals, and they grow in so much economic value that they now have like a stronger say in what how things should be ran essentially. What's sort of like your pushback on that, or just your general take?
Yeah, sure. No, I'd love to answer that. Give me 10 seconds to drop off camera because I see that I have like one of these things that's connected to a battery that's about to run out. So I need to plug that pointer. 10 seconds, sorry.
And HCT is going to happen in Bhutan fairly soon, right?
Pardon?
HCT, they are going to make one in Bhutan in the Gerefu Mindfulness City, right?
Yeah, they are. I think Timor said they broke ground. Yeah, Bhutan is doing quite a bit, and then they also have the crypto layer with the verified credential stuff that they're doing. Okay, Art is back.
Okay, I'm on a different mic, so can you hear me all right?
Yeah.
All right. Yeah, so to answer your question, obviously this is like the age-old first line of attack. You kind of feel like just sort of shrugging and saying like, we know this is rubbish, but it does need to be, it needs to be addressed. It needs to be addressed up front. So the best thing you can do as a project is literally start building your community relations right at the beginning. And I don't mean community relations with the people that already are affiliated to techno-optimism. Obviously, you're going to do that. No, that's your business model. I'm talking about reaching out to the people that are probably, the ones that would end up, rallying a bunch of activists or something. And the way you do that is finding what interests them and finding some kind of synergy there. So like what we did in Bhutan is we had a downtown space, which was a conference space, it was an event space, it was a co-working space. Bhutan's a tiny country, so it's kind of cool because you can like figure out how you could make that work almost optimally within a budget that's like humanly possible. And you can then maybe extrapolate that for a bigger country like Brazil's a lot more difficult. Way a lot. But yeah, one of the things we did there was we worked with nonprofits that, for example, were doing they were selling art to benefit kids that had been affected by parents taking drugs. We worked with all the big development guys as well, the big like the UN and World Bank and all of them. And they are connected. Remember that a lot of these attacks, like since we're amongst ourselves to some degree, a lot of these attacks come from the elites within the wealthy people. That's where they originate, and that's where they tend to get organized from. They don't really come as a grassroots, natural, organic response to us at all. They're kind of very intentional, calculated, often with some political agenda. And so a lot of those elites are very proximal to money sources like the UN, etc. So you have to kind of build a relationship with all of those guys as well, and that can be a beneficial thing as well in terms of them. So in our case, we had like events run by the UN, which paid for, etc. And it was good, and it gave us some credits with the type of elites that would normally otherwise be very hesitant. Bhutan's a bit of a unique case, but we were very popular. We had like 10% of the country following us on social media because the country is less than 1 million people. We had them very much positive, engaged. So like that really works. I think a lot of the projects maybe can improve on that because it doesn't necessarily have to cost money if you're hosting events and stuff, or if you provide a free or very subsidized rate to nonprofits and stuff to come in and use your spaces. I think that stuff does work. And you've got to kind of build those relationships with some of those elites in particular. It's a game that people play to some degree, but there's some real benefit if you try and pivot and do it right as well. So it can actually have some really good positive impact for the country as well. And then I just think it shouldn't be like a photo op. People know the difference as well. So got to actually like make it real and build those relations. But yeah, in terms of the narrative, because your specific question was like, how do you counter that narrative? Once that narrative is getting like some momentum, it is a bit difficult. And that's why I would say you want to get out ahead and set the narrative as quickly as you can as a new project. And luckily, on the flip side, because there's not many of these projects, it's difficult for people to attack you. It's another reason why you can do a phased approach, because if you start the conversation and you say we want this degree of autonomy, and the country doesn't know you, the people don't know you, you're kind of much more scary, right? But if you come in and you say we're going to have a phased approach, we're going to start with this, we're going to have some jobs, like it sounds like a factory or something. It's like, okay, we know what that is, that's normal, and you just phase it up in terms of your regulatory autonomy as well as your economic side. That can also work if you have the patience and tolerance to do that. So there's different ways, but I'd say the community outreach and maybe phasing your actual unlock as well, so that they get to know you. Because once you're a known entity, people are afraid of the unknown, and you can like whip people up if you're that type of demagogue about the unknown. Like Prospera was heavily attacked on a bunch of stuff that just isn't real, because it couldn't disprove it really, because it was unknown. Are they going to expropriate a bunch of land? Well, who knows? But they've said they aren't. It's in their constitution. So, but you say that because they haven't been around long enough. So you do. It does a phased approach.
I wonder, because you're right. Like, we don't have enough good examples to reference, and Prospera is like one of the only ones. So I'm just like, is this from a top down, that this like neocolonialism is like really understood at the top level, and that's sort of the barrier? And so even as much as you do like grassroots stuff, build community, there's still like the guy at the top that can just remove your contract, or like just cut all ties, and which like has downstream effects. And so I wonder, yes, in parallel, you have to do the legwork on the community side because it needs to be integrated. But then I feel like it requires a lot more education at the top level and the people who are actually making these things possible, because ultimately it's really difficult to do. And if you can't convince the decision makers, yeah, it's hard to get stuff done.
Yeah, so that's the tough thing as well, because it's difficult to point to examples that aren't politically contentious. Rendeavor is a good example in that sense, because they aren't politically contentious, they've done very well, but they're also not free cities. So we actually find it more useful sometimes to point to projects like that than maybe Prospera. But when you know that people are literate in the economics and everything, you can talk to them about, like in the case of Argentina, if you're talking to the national government, you could talk to them about Prospera. But in the case of the vast majority of global south countries, it is a big issue, and so you kind of have to like do it piecemeal. That's why you might want to start with a project that isn't quite a free city as your like prototypical example, because that is what they ask for. It's like one of the first things that always comes up, right? Like, where is this being done? How's it working? And that's very human. Like, that's how we all find out how we all try and understand things. So if our response is like this place that's under like constant attack of being all this controversy or nowhere, it doesn't really go much. So yeah, there's an education problem that we haven't got that track record. But that also kind of points to like what happens when there is a couple of good projects that we can point to. Like, that's exciting to think about, because that could unlock a snowball avalanche, of new projects. That's actually our thesis with League of Free Cities. We do think that will happen, and so we're excited to try and like play a hand in making sure that happens.
It's like slowly, then all at once. Because once you have like 2+ example, it's just like the J curve after that.
If you look at economic zones where there's tens of thousands now, I don't know the exact number. Someone called Adrian Opel Group, because they mapped them all once. But it's they did that. They just like there were none, and then they were everywhere. So yeah.
I think one really good model is, are you guys familiar with Etana in Nigeria? The digital free zone. I think they did a pretty good model. It's like a public-private partnership with the actual government. They have like autonomy for this free zone, and now they're like setting up physical spaces. So the PPP route really, I think, works really well because you align incentives. And as someone tweeted this the other day, when the whole stuff with Crescimento was happening, there was a bunch of drama on Twitter. Someone tweeted, it's not the politicians, it's not the citizens, it's simply the incentives at play, right? Like, politicians want to be able to do the things that gets them reelected to stay in power. And so it's a very interesting dynamic. I'm curious, like, how does this all fit into like the network state space? Because it's like physical cities, and now we're on the techno optimism side, and we're kind of just like merging the two. How do you see the integration between what you're doing and then the network state space?
Well, I do think they're kind of two faces of the same coin. I mean, the network state movement is the largest solution to why China cities aren't getting unlocked, and pretty much it's still something really powerful in and of itself. That like even if you never got charter cities, it would be something powerful. So that's probably why it works or should work in the long run. But one of the necessary approaches is to build a community, because I say that because like, why are we building charter cities? We're building them hopefully because, in my view, because we want to see a bunch of different governance experiments where people actually have like decentralized decision making, or decision making that's specific to where they are, and that's sensible and that's not tied to political cycles or lobbying incentives, that follows free market principle incentives typically, but maybe not always. I'm being libertarian, but I'm not. My view is that you need to let these experiments run. So if a lot of people want to set up a communist charter city, like they should have that option, and people should be able to vote with their feet. That's also important. But as long as people can leave, they should have that option, and that like would be really useful. Maybe I wish they had one of those near San Francisco. But no. Basically, if they had a bunch of these types of charter cities, that people were autonomously running with completely unique models, like they should be modeling also in the culture aspect. And so for network states, like they provide that. They're like a really good way of uniting people around at least one core shared value, right? There'll always be sub-values, and some of those will be really important, but they still statistically, just like we were talking about with the economic engine, statistically, there still has to be one top value. And so if you unite people around that, and that's maybe it's techno-optimism, that might be the value that's currently in the sort of network state methodology. That's a culture that can do something. I mean, techno-optimism in particular is a culture that can do something, in my opinion. But it's a case of if you want to build if you want to build something really novel and powerful, you do need that seed culture, and then you need the regulatory unlock to actually be able to do it with proper autonomy, which is what you can do if you have enough people and enough wealth and power sort of behind a particular shared value. So that is one way. You can also maybe do it if you sort of I don't know, the way that we've been trying to do it, like people in the space for a while, myself included, is just trying to explain the whole project to governments and the upside, and looking particularly at land that isn't heavily occupied. Like ideally, it would be greenfield land that nobody's really using. That's one of the reasons I'm really excited about Argentina. Because not everyone knows this, but like a huge part of Argentina in all of human history has never been occupied, which is like a lost frontier. So that's interesting because it provides an opportunity. But yeah, charter cities, you need a bunch of different experiments running autonomously, and you need the seed culture, and network states can provide that seed culture. It might be the best model to provide the seed culture.
Yeah, that makes sense. Argentina is like a insane ecosystem. This is my first time being here. I love it. So someone asked this question a while ago, and I want to pose it to you. Is it easy to go build a new private city, or is it easier to go and build a rocket and go to another planet? Which one is easier?
Free city, but that might change. I mean, I mean, yeah. Is this like, is Elon maybe watching? Yeah. No, I think privacy is obviously easier, but then some people are of the view like it doesn't matter. And unfortunately, the new view is like if you had AGI coming after you, I think this is Elon like legitimately concerned about this. Someone raised this, right? That it could chase you on a rocket anyway now. Like it could come after you if you're on Mars. I believe that like Elon had a moment when he realized that he wasn't happy. But I think the pre-privacy is way easier. I think it's getting easier also. I think we're going to hit a zeitgeist moment where you have an unlock of a bunch of these. I'm certainly going to do my best to play my part in trying to help that happen. And there's a ton of people that are doing a lot more. So I think we'll get there. And I think it'll become easier and easier. Of course, rockets should too, but I don't know. So far, it's very, very wealthy people that seem to be leading on that.
Well, we definitely appreciate all the work that you've been doing so far. I think like a lot of discourse and materials and learning lessons is, we're building our LLM to figure out how to build better cities. So we appreciate it. I know we're coming up to our last 2 minutes. How can the community get involved? Where can we find you? Any closing thoughts and words?
Elon, if you're watching, no, I'm just kidding. Definitely founders who are trying to build projects or who think they may want to build projects and ideally they have a country in mind and they're prepared to go and live there. We're always trying to incubate new founders and get new projects. In fact, in order for our fund model to succeed, we need like 50 projects of these for deal flow. So we're fully incentivized to try and help everyone unlock independent projects. And then, I'm doing all sorts of little things here and there. Always interested to hear from different people with different skill sets and see where that can be integrated in some way to like the Free City goals. What else? Nothing else really. But I really appreciate you guys having me on here. It was a pleasure chatting with everyone and sharing ideas. So enjoyed it. Thanks very much.
Awesome.
Amazing. Thanks so much, Art, for joining us. Everyone, welcome. We will be here next week on the same time, Thursday, talking about network states and building new cities and how to build new governance for the internet era, and actually like just better places to live and work. So waiting everyone there. So bye. Thank you.
Yeah.
Bye.